tenho a honra de apresentar para vocês hoje o professor Michael Jackson, que é editor da ISSS, né, e um dos grandes nomes do pensamento sistêmico no mundo. E a gente aguardava, eu particularmente aguardava com muita ansiedade a oportunidade de ter uma palestra dele no Congresso Brasileiro de Sistemas, assim como também aguardava com muita ansiedade a de outros nomes que estão aqui, como o professor Esperro. O professor Michael Jackson é nascido em 51, é professor de sistemas de gestão e ex-reitor da Cooper University Business School, estudou política, filosofia e economia na Universidade de Oxford, passou 4 anos no serviço público antes de retornar à vida acadêmica, e desde então ele estudou, lecionou na Universidade de Lancaster, Lincoln, Hull, e foi nomeado professor titular em 1989. Né? O professor Jackson foi presidente da Sistemas Society do Reino Unido e da IFSR, né? Que é a International Federation for System Research, e também da ISSS, que é a nossa grande referência aqui no Congresso Brasileiro de Sistemas. Ele também atuou no Conselho Operacional da Research Society, é membro da British Computer Society, também está, além de outros, né, além de outras entidades. E atualmente é professor visitante do Instituto Indiano de Tecnologia e professor honorário da Universidade Ricardo Palma, em Lima, do Peru. Enfim, é um grande nome. Professor Jackson, it's a great pleasure to have you here today. Feel free to start your lecture.
Thank you, Leonardo. Just to check, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Well, that sounded a very nice introduction. So thank you for that. I can't wait to hear what I've got to say after such a nice introduction. I hope you can see the title of my talk, which is Crisis, Global Change and Systemic Resilience, the need for a critical systems approach. The way I'm going to deliver this, Leonardo, with your help, is to do about half of the talk and then stop for questions, and then do the second half of the talk, so that I'm not talking for the full hour or so that I have. So I will stop after about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll have some questions at that point, if that's all right with you.
No problem, Professor.
Good. So perhaps we can go to the next slide, the structure of the presentation. Thank you. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the complexity that we have to manage in today's world. It's clearly this complexity that leads to many of the crises that we encounter, what Taleb would call black swan events. And it's because of that that we need resilience, an ability to adapt and change in the light of this, but also to bounce back better. I'm going to talk about the nature of complexity, because I think that how we understand complexity obviously has a big impact upon the way we seek to address it, and that matters. And I shall talk about 2 approaches to complexity. These terms derive from Edgar Morin. One is to treat complexity as restricted and to look at it through the lens of restricted complexity. The other is to treat it as general and to look at it through the lens of general complexity. And I'll give 2 examples. One successful systems engineering project on the Segura River in Spain, which was able to treat it as a case of restricted complexity and still to get extremely good results. And then I'll turn to the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK, and we'll see there that treating it as a case of restricted complexity led to many of the problems that we later encountered. It would have been better from the beginning to treat it as a case of general complexity, and a means for treating and dealing with general complexity, as I'll seek to explain, is critical systems thinking and practice. Okay, the next slide, please. Leonardo, next slide. Thank you. Many different organizations are discussing complexity today. These quotes are from the OECD 2018. And the first one is typical. It says complexity is a core feature of most policy issues today. Their components are interrelated in multiple hard-to-define ways, yet governments are ill-equipped to deal with complex problems. And you get the same message coming through from the United Nations, from an IBM survey of CEOs a few years back, from charities, from UNESCO, this belief that complexity is behind the problems that we face. And they also suggest that, as it says at the bottom, we adopt a systems approach. Unless we employ systems thinking, UNESCO was saying, OECD was saying, we'll fail to understand the world we are living in. Now, we've known about complexity in the systems movement for quite some time. Akoff used to refer to complex problems as messes, sets of interacting problems. And of course, we have the famous description of messes and the problems to which they give rise from Rittel and Weber, which calls them wicked problems. Messes give rise to wicked problems. So could we just see that definition on the next slide, please, Leonardo? So there's a Rittel and Weber definition of wicked problems. And it says the planner who works with open systems is caught up in the ambiguity of their causal webs. Moreover, her would-be solutions are confounded by a still further set of dilemmas posed by the growing pluralism of the contemporary publics, whose valuations of her proposals are judged against an array of different and contradicting scales. And it's interesting there that Rittel and Weber are pointing to two aspects of wicked problems. One is the ambiguity of causal webs, the interrelationships between the parts of wicked problems, but also the very different ways in which they are viewed, the different publics which are looking at wicked problems. So I want to now look more closely at the nature of complexity. So could I have the next slide, please, Leonardo? I can't see my slides now.
Leonardo, você vai ter que fazer o compartilhamento novamente.
Can you see my slide?
Leonardo?
Um minuto, estou tentando ver o que aconteceu aqui, porque não... Só um minuto.
É porque você tem que compartilhar a apresentação.
Sim, estava compartilhado.
Compartilhou a tela do PowerPoint.
Conseguiram ver agora?
There we go. That's excellent. Thank
okay.
you. This is the most common definition you find of the nature of complexity today. It gives rise to what is called a VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That definition started to become common from the late 1980s. It was first used in the US military's learning curriculum. But I beg to say that that definition in itself is somewhat ambiguous, in that it doesn't clearly distinguish between what we saw in Rittel and Weber's definition, the causal links which might actually exist in the world, and the different publics, the different ways of perceiving the problem situation. So we probably need to go a bit deeper. And to do that, I've looked into the work of the philosopher Rescher. He's a US pragmatist philosopher who wrote a book in 1998 on the nature of complexity, and whose work is it's been reprinted recently. And I think it's a very good introduction to types of complexity. So could we have a look at that, please, Leonardo? Next slide. Rescher distinguishes between two types of complexity. You see there ontological complexity and cognitive complexity, although the two are interrelated for Rescher. So it's an analytical distinction. Ontological complexity, he says, is the complexity that is seen to exist in the real world. It's actually there in the world. And here we have a fairly familiar set of the things that contribute to ontological complexity, which is the quantity of elements, the variety of those elements, the nature of the elements, that is, and the elaborateness of the interrelationships, how difficult they are to unravel. Now, for Rescher, ontological complexity is, he says, inexhaustible. Science is and will continue to find out more and more things about the nature of physical reality. With social reality, the situation is even more complex, and more different ways and views of looking at social reality emerge all the time. So ontological complexity is inexhaustible, whether that's in the physical world or the social world. Now that means that for Rescher, that cognitive complexity is extremely important, and this is the way that this expresses different ways in which the world is viewed. So this turns from the world itself to the observer of the world. And because ontological complexity is inexhaustible, we are, of course, subject. We can't grasp it all, and so we have cognitive limitations which present us with a very partial view of the world. It gives rise to what Warfield called spreadthink, different views, different perspectives on the nature of problem situations and how we might go about tackling them. When John Warfield was looking at complexity, he came up with 20 causes, and 17 of those 20 were to do with cognitive complexity. And of course, it's made worse by the fact that we have different interests in the world, we pursue different purposes, and conflict results. So let's keep in mind that distinction between ontological and cognitive complexity, and the particular importance of cognitive complexity as far as Rescher is concerned. Next slide, please, Leonardo. Okay, now I'm switching it around a little bit now, and I'm looking through Moran's eyes at the different ways that people perceive complexity. And according to Moran, there are two ways of looking at complexity that you'll find if you study those who look at complexity and seek to manage it. And you can view it as restricted complexity, or you can view it and seek to tackle it as a case of general complexity. Now, if you try and deal with complexity as restricted complexity, you remain pretty much within, as it says there, the epistemology of classical science. That's Morin's terms, that's his phrase. So you seek underlying causes for complex system behavior, just as science does for the regularities it witnesses in the world. And this sort of approach, for example, might be found in traditional system dynamics, where you look for the relationship between feed-forward, feedback loops, and lags. Those are the linkages underlying complex system behavior, which you can cover using system dynamics or agent-based modeling, where you take different agents, give them different characteristics, and see what emergent properties arise from that. What are the underlying reasons for the emergent properties? And this has risen to some excellent work in formalization of mathematical kind of modeling, and it's encouraged interdisciplinary work. You don't get system dynamicists working within one discipline, and those are all good things, Morin would say. But unfortunately, with cognitive complexity about, it's quite hard to be successful if we just deal with complexity in terms of that definition of restricted complexity. So Morin points to a different way of looking at complexity, which is to see it as general complexity. And general complexity is hypercomplexity. It's complexity of such an extent that it resists all universal truths. And as a result, we can only address it, we must accept that any attempts to model it are partial. We only understand some parts of it when we attempt to model it or to look at it from our particular perspectives. So that immediately means that our focus becomes on cognitive complexity, upon the way that we view complexity and the way that our partial understandings of it impact the way that we act upon it. So the fundamental problem becomes, in Morin's terms, epistemological, cognitive, and paradigmatic. In other words, how do we understand and seek to manage complexity? That has an impact back, and in general complexity becomes the focus of attention, the most important aspect, rather than some attempt to try and understand complex system behavior. Okay, I want now to turn to my first example, which was a successful systems engineering project, which was able to treat the world in terms of restricted complexity. So perhaps I could have the next slide, Leonardo. Thank you. This is the Segura River in southern Spain, a very important river basin because 20% of Spain's exports of fruit and vegetables come from there. But at the beginning of the 21st century, the Segura River was in a terrible state. There'd been a period of drought. It was becoming more and more polluted through a rise in the canning industry and because of domestic waste. No water flowed much to the mouth of the river. Fauna and flora were decaying, and the banks of the river were decaying as well. And there was an increased need for water for irrigation for the fruit and vegetables, but that wasn't available. Now, I know this well because in 2011, my wife and I bought a house next to the Segura River without realizing at that time, we did it quickly, that it was the most polluted river in Spain. There were demonstrations in There were demonstrations in Murcia about the state of the river and its pollution, about the stench from the river, and essentially it was, in the terms of the people looking at it, it was an open sewer. But a systems engineering project had taken place, led by Miguel Angel Rodenas, and in a period of 10 years, the state of that river was completely transformed. Could we have the next slide, please, Leonardo? And there's a transformation described by Bill McCann. It must be a rare, if not unique, experience for a nationally important European river to be transformed within 10 years from the most polluted to the best quality in its homeland. But that can be said of the Segura in southeastern Spain. And in 2011, it was awarded a prize for such a successful project. Next slide, please. Here are some of the successes. The river flow was improved, so it flowed from its source to the sea. 99% of wastewater was collected and treated in the region, and there was no perceptible pollution in the river throughout its 350-kilometer length. Water supply was increased by 14% to help with irrigation. That could be put back into the river from the wastewater plants because of the success of those plants. And life had come back to the river. There was fishing, water sports, canoeing. There was wildlife. Otters were seen in Murcia in the river. Bird life, marbled teal, white-headed ducks. And 2 of the reservoirs that were created were included on the Ramsar list of wetlands of international importance, which were extremely useful for birds on migration. Fauna and flora was back, more water was being put back into the river, and the river was totally unpolluted, and it flowed from its source to the sea. No longer was it an open sewer, a water canal, but you could regard it as a natural system. Now, why and how was this successful? Next slide, please, Leonardo. Why was the project successful? It was treated as a case of restricted complexity, and systems engineering was used, so the concentration was on what we might call ontological complexity, which was high in this case, but it was low in cognitive complexity. People came round to seeing the necessity of the project, and there was the political will to overcome obstacles and to drive the project through. Pre-planning was possible. It wasn't something that just arose from nothing. It wasn't a black swan event, an emergency. It was an emergency, but didn't arise just out of nothing. And so an advanced study could be made of treatment plants, ones that worked elsewhere in the world. There could be public consultations and an environmental impact assessment. Technical expertise was necessary. We had to understand the ontological complexity, but it was available. There was knowledge of the way to treat wastewater, of how to design the best treatment plants. There was knowledge of scheduling techniques which allowed primary, secondary and tertiary facilities to be appropriately scheduled. And the flow of water in the river could be modelled from the source to the sea. And in systems engineering, system of systems terms, the different elements that involved in the project were in harmony. So you could regard them as system of systems. If you increased water availability, which made better water available for irrigation through water treatment, then those two things could be treated together. and they would also help you to address the environmental concerns. There was no disharmony there. And people came around to seeing it as a necessary project to undertake because of this dire state in which the river was in. And there were difficulties initially with the local authorities because each of them had control over their local water treatment plants. And so there had to be the political decision to push through the creation of a general water authority for the whole of the Murcia region, which took over powers to manage the water treatment system within Murcia. And that did cause a few issues, but nevertheless, it was possible to drive it through the Murcian parliament and gain agreement to the creation of that unified water authority and to tight monitoring of discharges into the river and to fines on a polluter pays basis. So again, a rigorous attempt to address the situation, but was acceptable in the context. So in this context, it was possible to overcome the social and political barriers to success, mainly the local authorities wanting to cling on to the power of treating their water locally and opposition to the discharge levy. And so it was a case that could be treated as one of ontological complexity, as a case of restricted complexity, and the results were excellent because of the low cognitive complexity involved. Next slide, please, Leonardo. So that's me. I was very happy because it meant that my house on the Segura River went up in value and we could live there without the stench from the river. This is, so I became quite familiar with the project, and this is me with Miguel Ladenas and the European River Prize from the International River Foundation, which the project was awarded as a successful systems engineering project in 2016. Next slide, please, Leonardo. A successful systems engineering project, canoeing and rafting, and I'm actually in that boat. I'm not, I have to say, I'm not one of the people with an oar at the back steering it, but I am in the middle of the boat on the Segura River, clinging on for my life to the two ladies on either side of me. Okay, I want to stop at that point, Leonardo, if that's okay, to take any questions or points of clarification before proceeding with an example of general complexity and how we might approach general complexity.
Ok. Pessoal, está aberto para questionamentos para o professor Michael Jackson. Alguém teria alguma consideração a fazer? As pessoas que quiserem fazer alguma pergunta, algum questionamento, podem levantar a mão e podem passar diretamente para o professor Jackson em inglês ou solicitar que a gente traduza se for o caso. O Márcio Vasconcelos tem uma pergunta. Pode fazer diretamente, Marcos? Pode abrir o microfone e pode fazer diretamente.
Hello, can you listen to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I can hear.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. It was very good presentation. I put on the chat also, but I can say aloud. Can the political polarization we see currently in the world, for instance, in the US, but here in Brazil, where we live, is it a cognitive complexity? Do you think we can classify our political polarization, extreme polarization, as a part of a cognitive complexity?
Yeah, as I say at the beginning, the two cognitive complexity, ontological complexity, of course, interrelate. But I'm seeing that just for these analytical purposes, and for the purpose of this presentation, as a form of difference in worldview, and therefore one of cognitive complexity. Of course, it will be embedded in problems in society, division of labour, class structures, etc. But in terms of dealing with issues of this kind, it's a form of cognitive complexity, yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Mais alguém?
Okay.
Uma pergunta, Leonardo, no chat.
I have a question.
Okay.
Professor, my
Yeah.
name is Alex Brazil. I'm very glad to hear your presentation. How do you see the application of systems thinking intertwined with, I would say, current methods suggested by economics Nobel Prizes in the realm of behavior and institutional economics?
I'm afraid that's not really a question that I can answer, because I'm not all that familiar with the literature on institutional economics. When I do the second part of the talk, it may be that you can provide that link for me better than I can.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Léo, tem uma pergunta no chat, você poderia ler para o professor Jackson?
Pergunta do Rafael Gonzalez.
Sim.
Okay, Professor.
Yes.
The question from Rafael Gonzalez was, I wonder if the distinction between the two types of complexities may lead to pure political problem solving, where the complexity is not addressed in reality, only in the mind.
Yes. I think you could go to either extreme. You could treat complexity as just being in the world, and have a great deal of difficulty, for example, getting your recommendations implemented, because you've not dealt with the cognitive complexity, the different worldviews that people might bring to the party, to the way that they look at the problem situation. Or you could go the opposite way and simply deal with the cognitive complexity, seek to dissolve, if you like, the differences of opinion and the worldviews that people bring to the problem situation, but be left with nowhere to go in terms of designing what you might regard as a system to be more resilient in confronting the extraordinary situations that it might face. So I think that systems thinking has to bring both approaches which recognize the importance of ontological complexity and bring to the table approaches that recognize the importance of cognitive complexity. And that's particularly the case perhaps with something like COVID-19, as I will go on to try and suggest in the second part of this talk.
Ok. Mais alguém?
Okay, Leonardo, shall I go on?
Yes. There is no more question, Professor. Questions.
Okay, good. Could you show the next slide then?
No problem.
Right, I just want to remind you about general complexity. it resists universal truths, and therefore all attempts to model it are partial. In the case of the Segura River project, you could arrive at a genuine shared understanding of what needed to be done, and you could create models of the flow of the river from the source to the sea, and model the impact of the different wastewater treatment plants. So that corresponded to you could manage it looking at it as a case of restricted complexity, but with general complexity there are no universal truths. So the problem becomes epistemological. How do we seek to gain knowledge? Cognitive, the way that we perceive and look at it, and paradigmatic, the various worldviews or paradigms that we bring to bear in looking at the problem situation. General complexity is more about the way we understand and seek to manage complexity. And it particularly concerns aspects of cognitive complexity, what Rescher called cognitive complexity. Those become significant, the different ways the world is viewed. Because of our cognitive limitations, we can't understand the whole. Because of spreadthink, different ways of looking at perceiving the nature of problem situations, and because of the conflict, the different interests that we might have and different purposes we might pursue in making our way in the world. So that's general complexity, and approaches such as systems engineering will be limited in what they can do if we are facing a case which can be described best as one of general complexity. And our problem-solving approach needs to change too. Leonardo, next slide, please. I think we may have missed a slide. Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you. No, that's fine. Let's go back. So in approaching general complexity, I'm putting forward the need for a critical systems thinking and practice. And that's based upon these principles of viewing the world as a case of general complexity. That it's impossible for any one systems or complexity approach to provide an understanding that permits causal explanation, prediction, and control of complex system behavior. So in cases of general complexity, system dynamics, agent-based modeling will only take you so far, but they'll be partial. There's no way with general complexity that you can use that kind of formalization, that kind of modeling within the traditional scientific paradigm to explain, predict, and control. So in that sense, if you look at complex adaptive systems as cases of general complexity, then they're unknowable. But what you can do is to undertake an informed exploration of complex problem situations, what Akoff called messes, using a multi-perspectival approach, looking at it from different perspectives, informed perspectives, as we'll go on to see. And to ensure you get a rounded approach towards dealing with the difficulties that the problem situation throws up, and you come to recognize through your multi-perspectival approach, you need to use different systems approaches in informed combinations. And we're not ruling out those attuned to restricted complexity. They will be of importance too. But you'll need a range of systems approaches used in informed combinations to seek improvement in complex problem situations. Next slide, please, Leonardo. So what we're doing in shifting from a view of the world as being one of restricted complexity to one of general complexity is changing the way we think about problems. We're no longer looking at them as puzzles for which typically there is a correct solution, and once solved, they are solved forever. The Segura River case wasn't quite like that, but it was certainly solved for some good period of time. And the puzzle metaphor works with restricted complexity. But with general complexity, you need to shift to a different metaphor, what Lakoff and Johnson call a chemical metaphor. Accepting it as a fact that no problem ever disappears forever, rather than direct your energies towards solving your problems once and for all, you would direct your energies towards finding out what catalysts will dissolve your most pressing problems for the longest time without precipitating worse ones. And the reappearance of a problem is viewed as a natural occurrence rather than a failure on your part to find the right way to solve it. And I would argue that's a better way of looking at the crises that we face, global crises we face these days. COVID-19 will probably not go away, even if we, as we look like doing, find a vaccine. Other pandemics will come along. And if not other pandemics, other forms of crisis will come along. We're not going to be able to solve these problems forever. It's a matter of dealing with them, expecting new ones to arise, expecting old ones to come to the fore again, and managing this process as you go along. It's a natural occurrence. It's not a failure on your part that you can't once and for all solve problems. So this is, I'm going to move on now to the critical systems thinking and practice approach to adopting this chemical metaphor, dealing with, looking at the world in terms of general complexity and managing cognitive as well as ontological complexity. So next slide, please. So if we think in critical systems terms and adopt critical systems practice, this has four main stages, which I bring to mind with the mnemonic EPIC. First of all, there's this exploring of the problem situation through using a multi-perspectival approach, looking at it through different perspectives. And then there's producing an appropriate intervention strategy, which is using a variety of systems approaches, methodologies, models, and methods in combination. Then there's intervening flexibly, being ready to change around your strategy as the problem situation evolves and changes and develops, partly as a result of the intervention itself, and a constant checking on progress, shown diagrammatically in the next slide. Lovely pinks. So I just want to concentrate on the first of those, 1 and 2, since we're not doing an intervention here, but we'll be looking at the first two stages in relation to COVID-19. Exploring the problem situation, I advocate, and I'll explain why, viewing it from 5 systemic perspectives in order to identify the primary and the secondary issues that we are facing in any problem situation that can be described as one of general complexity. And then producing an intervention strategy, we have to know the strengths and the weaknesses of the different systems approaches, and we need to choose the most appropriate systems methodologies, models, and methods, given the primary and secondary issues that we've uncovered during the explore stage. Okay, I'm going to go on to the 5 systemic perspectives that we might usefully use to explore the problem situation. So the next slide, please, Leonardo. Now, these are my criteria for arriving at an appropriate multi-perspectival approach, the 5 systemic perspectives. And these are the principles I used for arriving at them. First is well summarized by Donna Meadows. She said, this is the main leverage point for making change. And she said, keep oneself unattached in the arena of paradigms. Stay flexible, realize that no paradigm is true, that every paradigm is tremendously limited. So she accepts this partial reality view of general complexity. You can't grasp the whole thing. And you need a wide variety of ways of looking at problem situations through different paradigms. But this should not be, in my view, random. We need to choose systemic perspectives, which give us not just a wide view of the problem situation, but an insightful view of the problem situation. And Pepper calls these world hypotheses. There are certain ways of viewing the world which over time, through the history of philosophy and science, have proven to be what he calls successes of cognition. They're adequate world hypotheses. They reflect the centuries, thousands of years of the creative discoveries of generations. So these are not random. They're a wide range of systemic perspectives, but they're not random. They're well aimed. They're based upon successes of cognition, proven creative discoveries of humankind, which have served us well over generations. In Lakoff and Johnson's terms, they're experiential gestalts. So they've not only served us well in terms of understanding the world, they've enabled us successfully to function in the physical and the social world. So they've acted as guides to us and provided us with a measure of success in our interactions in adapting to the resistances that the physical and the social world put up. And so we've learned these experiential gestalts. They are useful. They're not random again. They've proven useful. So let's have a look at what these 5 systemic perspectives are that cover the ground and are also, in my view, useful. Next slide, please. So this is, again, the explore stage of critical systems practice, and we use these 5 systemic perspectives based upon world hypotheses that have proven useful, upon paradigms that have served us to understand the world, and metaphors which are have worked as experiential gestalts. And I've come up with these 5, which are good ways of addressing problem situations to come up with primary issues that need addressing. You can look at problem situations through the machine systemic perspective. That's proven useful throughout human history. What are the goals we're seeking to pursue? What are the inputs that we need? What are the outputs we're trying to achieve? Do we have all the people, money, materials people in place to run the machine effectively? Are the processes working right? We can view a problem situation through the organism systemic perspective. Are the parts functioning well to serve the whole? Is the whole capable of adapting and changing to its environment and growing in relation to its environment, so that it's not just resilient but anti-fragile? Cultural and political systemic perspective. Are we sure there's not groupthink? Have we got a diverse set of perspectives which could prove useful to us? But have we ways of dealing with conflict? And can we bring about mutual understanding? If we look at it through the societal, environmental, systemic perspectives, we become alerted to the views of different stakeholders and whether we are in fact taking into account the views of the variety of stakeholders. And that will include future generations and those stakeholders who might represent the environment and the concerns of the environment. So we're looking to incorporate the different stakeholders in our understanding of the world, their views, including understanding of the world, and also in any designs or changes we might make. And a typically systemic perspective from systems thinking, the interrelationships perspective, because the other four will throw up primary issues, but these are likely to be interrelated in such a way that we may be able to gain some understanding of if we seek to do so. So if you throw those perspectives at general complexity, at ontological and cognitive complexity, then you've got a chance of identifying the primary issues, because there are a wide set of perspectives, but they are focused and they take advantage of experiential gestalts that have proven useful to us in the past. Now, it so happens, and it's extremely useful to the case, that we actually have systems, approaches and methodologies which correspond to these different systemic perspectives. So next slide, please, Leonardo. So we can produce an intervention strategy by choosing appropriate systems, methodologies, models and methods to use in combination, if we gain an awareness of which of those systemic perspectives points to most of the primary issues that we're encountering in our case of general complexity. So if most of the primary issues that we're confronting are of a mechanical nature, can be represented in, if you like, through an input-output model and making sure you've got all the parts present and the process is working right, then you can address the issues through systems engineering, and that will give you good results, as it did in the Segura River project, which you could perceive that way. If it comes to be the case that we look at it and we see lots of organismic complexity, then a viable systems diagnosis and its primary tool, its main tool, the viable system model, will be a guide and an assistance to integrating those elements which need to be present for that viable system to adapt and change and take advantage of opportunities in its environment. So can it change? It can change when it wants to. It can remain the same when it wants to. It can co-evolve with its environment while remaining with its own identity. If the analysis, the exploration of problem situation throws up cultural and political complexity as the main issues to address, then you're thrown onto soft systems approaches. If it becomes an issue of certain stakeholders being excluded or disadvantaged, then an approach such as critical systems heuristics, which identifies disadvantaged stakeholders and seeks to give them a voice, will prove to be a useful approach to adopt. And of course, what will happen is that your analysis, your exploration of problem situation is likely to throw up problem issues in each of these areas. Each of the systemic perspectives will point you to issues, and you may be able to see some interrelationships between these issues, looking through the perspective of system dynamics and feedback and feed-forward loops. But each of the perspectives will tell you something. You'll gain a greater appreciation of the general complexity that you're confronting, that you're seeking to address. And even if they come out with conflicting messages about what it is that you're tackling and what a way to go about tackling it, then you will gain a better awareness of that complexity through this form of approach. So let me go on to my example of a case of general complexity with the next slide. And my example is COVID-19 in the UK. And of course, I'm aware that Brazil has been hit by COVID-19 extremely badly, as has the UK. We've both in the same boat, been in the same boat. And I here am in Hull in the UK, which was the worst affected city in terms of new cases last week. This week, it's the second most affected city in the UK. It's raining outside and I'm locked down. So I'm not very happy about the way that COVID-19 has been treated in the UK. And I think in very general terms, you could argue that the problem arose, or many of the difficulties that later came about occurred because a case of general complexity, once the disease had got out into the community and was impacted by our ability to organize to deal with it, by different perspectives on how we should deal with it, on different political aspirations. Once it got out, then it became a case of general complexity, and too long we sought to treat it as a case of restricted complexity. So in the United Kingdom, for too long, we were messing about with epidemiological models, which people believed would explain the way the disease might evolve and develop and spread in the community. And that could be mathematically modeled, either by the Imperial College model or other models. The trouble was, of course, that what you need for successful models of that kind, information about the variables, how many cases there are, how the disease transmits itself from one person to another, what the rates of transmission are, none of those things were available. So the models came up with widely different predictions about how many cases there would be, from 20,000 to 500,000 in the UK, using pretty much the same models. And yet politicians hung on to these models, or hid behind these models, some would say, hid behind the science, the so-called science, for far too long. And this was a case of treating general complexity as restricted complexity. As the complexity theorist Taleb and Bar-Yam put it, it's a case of someone watching an avalanche heading in their direction. They do not call for complicated statistical models to see if they need to get out of the way. But that's what was happening in the UK. People messing about refining those statistical models as the avalanche was about to hit us, and ignoring swift and quick action that had proven successful elsewhere, such as lockdowns, such as closing the borders, such as putting people who were tracked and traced as having the disease into isolation in hotels. These were all measures that were used extremely successfully, for example, in Australia. We were still in the UK having flights direct from Wuhan, 3 a day, where in Australia they'd already closed the borders. We were playing about with our models, which could deal with restricted complexity, but not with the general complexity that we were facing. Next slide, please, Leonardo. Now, how might we have prepared better for COVID-19 if we'd used critical systems thinking and practice? There was attempts to prepare for a pandemic, although done on the basis of a future flu pandemic, or a thing called Operation Cygnus in the UK, but there was no follow-up and the variables wouldn't have fitted anyway. But if our preparedness had taken place on the basis of critical system thinking and practice, I suggest to you that we might have done a bit better by way of preparation. We would have looked at the potential pandemic through the machine perspective, and we'd have wondered whether we had the people in place and the equipment in place to deal with any future pandemic. Of course, we didn't. We had a shortage of staffing in the National Health Service. In the UK, there was a shortage of beds. We didn't have the personal protective equipment, the PPE. We didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't have enough testing facilities. Many had been closed down or outsourced to private providers. We didn't have a track and trace system in place, nor the people to staff it. Now, I'd argue that if you'd looked closely through the machine perspective in advance, your attention would have been drawn to all those issues. You may still not have addressed them, but you could hardly have ignored them. If you'd looked at it, a future pandemic, through the organism perspective, you'd have wondered about how your system might have had the capacity, the variety, the adaptability to cope with the problem situation as it was likely to develop. And you would have wondered whether the centralized system, which the NHS tended to be, and which plans for dealing with any pandemic were based upon, would actually work in the UK case. Wouldn't it be better to decentralize, to build upon the infrastructure that was already in place locally for dealing, for example, tracking and tracing sexually transmitted diseases? You'd have worried about the issue of centralization and decentralization. If you had looked through the cultural and political systemic perspective in preparation for a pandemic, you'd have worried about whether the science upon which government was relying emerged from groupthink, that the body called SAGE, which was advising the government, wasn't so embedded in traditional science, basing itself upon, for example, epidemiological modeling, the kind of modeling appropriate for restricted complexity, that its results were going to be inappropriate and its advice unlikely to be useful in this situation. You'd have wondered about how to gain some kind of mutual understanding between different groups, how to communicate in such a way that discussions, once the pandemic was open to public and political discussion, was actually managed in a way which would take people along with you, rather than become subject to political opportunism. In the UK, the different bodies in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as well as England, going in their own directions and making political capital out of it. Local bodies seeing it as a resource bargaining opportunity. You'd have had to try and look at how that might have been managed. Those things might have been managed in advance. If you'd looked through the societal environmental perspective, you could hardly have not noticed that the pandemic was likely to have an unequal impact upon different sections of the community. That those at the front line in the health service, those at the front line, for example, in transport, they would be hit the hardest. Those who had jobs which were people facing would be hit the hardest. Those who lived in multi-generational households, many of people from the BAME, the Black and minority ethnic communities, were involved in these kinds of jobs and in these kinds of cultural prospects. Those things could hardly have been ignored. And yet in practice, this seems to have come as a complete surprise to decision makers, only being noticed halfway through the attempt to deal with the pandemic. And if you looked at through the interrelationships perspective, you could have hardly not noticed that the relationship between the National Health Service and care homes was not joined up. So that when the pandemic took hold and the government wanted to empty hospitals to save the NHS, people were dumped back into care homes, and there was no real joining up there. People were not tested before they went back into care homes, and people were not allowed out of care homes to hospitals, even if they were in the flows of the disease, because of the danger of spreading the disease within hospitals. And agency staff were going around care homes and shifting between them. There were a set of interrelationships that led to the disaster which occurred in care homes, which were not thought through. I saw an epidemiological modeler on the news, the Panorama program the other night, and asked why they hadn't thought about these issues when they were doing their modeling. And he said they just had not done so. It was outside the ken. So you could not have been, I would argue, better prepared. You must have been better prepared if you thought this way. Next slide, please, Leonardo. And in producing an intervention strategy, we can see that there would have been systems methodologies. Of course, the bird would have flown in many cases, and you'd have been dealing with an emergency already on top of you. But had you had a chance to prepare in the way that we've described, there were systems methodologies that could have been helpful to you. For people and equipment shortages, we could have relied upon systems engineering. We could have planned in advance to fill the gaps in people and materials, and to look to make sure that our testing, tracking processes were in place. In terms of centralization versus decentralization, we could have had discussions and debates, and we could have arrived at conclusions about what needed to be centralized and what needed to be decentralized in bringing about an appropriate coordinated response to the pandemic. I guess the United States is a case where far too much was decentralized. The UK was a case where far too much was centralized. So announcements were coming from the centre, and nobody in the UK could believe them because they simply did not correspond to what was going on the ground, because people at the centre didn't know what was going on the ground. People who knew what was going on the ground, for example, in Leicester when the second pandemic hit, had no authority to deal with it locally. We could have found better ways of managing those problems. If we do soft systems approaches, once the thing had clearly gone beyond the capacity of traditional science, no longer be dealt with as a case of restricted complexity, then we could have used soft systems approaches to challenge the groupthink of traditional science, to open it up to systems thinkers and complexity theorists. We could have used soft systems approaches to help decision makers and the political process think better through the implications and the outcomes of possible strategies. And we could have sought to bring about better ways of communicating with the public so that politicians and the strategies were better trusted. Communication was dreadful. As soon as it became clear that the UK was doing worse than other European countries, then the politicians dropped the graphs showing the comparisons. Of course, trust just dissipated. If we had thought in advance about issues of inequality and who might be hit most by the pandemic, then we could have used an approach which is critical systems heuristics to explore exactly who the disadvantaged groups were, what the problems were that might have arisen, sought to give voice to those groups that would suffer more, and to take action which may have mitigated or ameliorated the problems that later occurred. And if we looked at it through the lens of system dynamics, then we would have perhaps picked up some of the interrelationships between the NHS and the NHS and care homes that would have avoided the disaster that that emerged there, with about 5% of people within the care home system within the UK, 20,000 people out of 400,000 dying because of the disaster which came within the care home sector. And of course, these things are interrelated. It's the case that the care homes were ignored because the boundary was drawn around the NHS. And care homes were, in a sense, marginalized. You get that insight from critical systems heuristics. From looking at the cultural aspects through soft systems approaches, you could see that the NHS was prioritized rather than care homes. We have this myth of the NHS in the UK. It had to be saved. If you looked through the lens of viable systems diagnosis, you'd have looked at the other aspects which are part of the viable system within the health service, which were perhaps treatments for cancer and heart disease, which somehow were neglected when COVID came to the fore. So you do learn different things and different explanations, but you gain a much greater appreciation of the complexity facing you. You realize you have a set of systems, methodologies, and approaches which can tackle those that complexity, even if you have to use them in combination and prioritize some, put some on the back burner, treat some issues as primary and some as secondary because the mess is already upon you. I have to feel sorry for those decision makers who are involved, and the politicians and the scientists who are involved in trying to deal with this process, because all these things seem to have occurred and evolved at once. But they were partially to blame for not alerting themselves to the issues that would occur earlier, and for not dealing satisfactorily with them once they had emerged. So I'm going to conclude at that point, and just Leonardo, if you show the book where I summarize this form of general thinking, which is the last slide, and then I'm happy to, there it is. Management of complexity, COVID was an example, and critical systems thinking and practice, I've argued, would have given you a better approach for dealing with that form of general complexity. It's an illustrative example only, but it's one that we're all familiar with, and therefore I chose it in this presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Jackson. Are you open for questions?
Yes, absolutely. I finished.
Ok. Pessoal, está aberto para perguntas. Quem tiver alguma pergunta a fazer, por favor, pode usar a função de levantar a mão ou pedir a palavra aqui no menu lateral, por favor, no lado direito. Christian está pedindo a palavra, pode falar.
Hello, Professor Jackson.
Hello, Christian.
It's Christian from University of Ribeirão Preto. How can we deal nowadays with not only with the lack of information, but with the bad quality of the information that is available in a situation of complex and critical systems as we are facing in COVID? Here in Brazil, we have a very deep problem in this terms of quality of information. and it's really hard to mobilize a society around this problem because of the information and the fake news and lack of information. What is your perspective about this specific issue in terms of consolidating a vision of the problem to create a full figure about what is the system we're dealing with?
Okay, I think here we have a case where, if you like, ontological and cognitive complexity clearly interrelate. The models that I think most countries started off using as their way of addressing the issue, the epidemiological models, were treated initially as means of potentially providing predictions which would enable you to act appropriately to control the pandemic. And information was provided on the back of those models. But it soon became clear that those models were useless for that kind of purpose. And you couldn't display that. You couldn't really display that. The scientists did a good job of hiding how useless that information was, and they tried to present policymakers with a unified view, combining the results of different models to do that. And the models then became more, as far as they were used at all, they then became a model of just tracking what was actually going on. So figures were, all you've got, the information you were getting from the centre was information about what was going on. So where the case on the national level, where the cases were, and what seemed to be the transmission rates, and that was of some use if it had been conveyed appropriately. But there was always a political dimension to it, what you call, I guess, false news, which tried to present the government in a good light, as doing well compared to other countries, when we manifestly were doing badly, and that lost trust. You got to a position soon where the information available centrally was of very little use locally. But the people who could have acted locally on what they knew simply didn't have the authority to act. So you got people in Leicester, for example. I use Leicester as an example because they were waiting weeks with quite a lot of local information at their disposal, but no authority to act upon that. The track and trace system when it was introduced centrally. There was no local involvement, so you couldn't get to those people who the central system couldn't contact. So I think it's a matter of this is not brain science really. It's a matter of seeing what information can be collected centrally, usefully collected centrally, about the disease and its spread, because you're getting more information from different places there, and it's then useful to analyze centrally and then send out locally again to try and influence decision making locally. But to accept that most of the useful information you actually need to provide you with the capacity and the variety to act locally is only available locally, and therefore you have to give responsibility and authority to people to act upon that local information as it becomes available. So that's a very convoluted explanation, but it perhaps shows how the idea about centralization, decentralization, about presenting good information, about being on the same page and mutual understanding, all these things interact in this kind of case. So I hope that's of some relevance to your question, Christian.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Professor Alberto Paucar levantou a mão também, Christian.
Isso. Professor Alberto.
Alberto, are you there?
Mais alguém? Mais alguma questão?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Hello, Alberto. Are you in Manchester?
Hello. Yes, I'm not in Manchester, near Lancaster. Oh, hello.
Near Lancaster.
Yeah, Mike. Thank you very much for the talk. My question is related to the theory of your talk, and I think it's well known that in the systems thinking community we use these terms of hard complexity and soft complexity. Now, I understand that there is a link between what you mentioned about restricted complexity and general complexity, to those two terms that we are used to use. So my question is, what new insights bring this way of seeing things, the ontological complexity and the epistemological complexity? What new insights, as opposed to what we used to call hard systems approach and the soft systems approach, to cope with hard complexity and soft complexity?
Okay, thanks, Alberto. Yes, I think I'm not sure when you use the concepts like hard complexity and soft complexity. It bears to mind. It still, for me, separates out the notion that you have a sort of complexity in the world that you can define as hard and soft, and therefore you can deal with the hard aspects and you can deal with the soft aspects and you can engineer the thing. I think Rescher is saying more. I think Rescher is saying more than that with ontological and cognitive complexity, in that the two are because ontological complexity, as he puts it, is inexhaustible. We're always going to be in the realm of, as we learn, as we think about things differently, the world starts to change for us. As we learn more about the world, the way we think about it, it's going to change for us. It's this interrelationship between the two that he's, in a sense, drawing attention to, and which I may have started to separate again. And Moran is, and I'll give you an example of the interrelationship between the two, Alberto, if I may, in a sec. But Moran is very much is saying something different again. And he's saying, well, some people look at complexity as though it's restricted complexity, and they engage it and deal with it in this sort of way. Other people treat it as if it's general complexity, and they have a more difficult job because they can't get away with believing that these system dynamics models or their agent-based models are going to be able to explain what's going on, and on the basis of that predict what's going to happen and enable us to control events. So that's turning it round, if you like. Now, it's in something like the emergence of an awareness of perhaps the inequalities which are bound up with the way that this pandemic has evolved, where you get close to understanding best the interrelationship between ontological and cognitive complexity. Because nobody seems to have thought about it at the beginning. And then they suddenly say, hang on, from my perspective, it seems to me that people from Black and minority ethnic groups are getting this virus and dying of it far more often than others. So then you start to look at the nature of the world to understand why that might be the case. well, they often don't have very good jobs, and they're on buses and they're confronting people all the time, or they live in multi-generational households. You start to explore that, and that feeds back into your understanding of the problem situation, into the cognitive complexity, and so the two evolve hand in hand. But as I say, that we have, fortunately, in the systems community, understood this for some time, and certainly messes in Akoff's terms were, and more the Rittel and Weber thing. That there you have in that quote again from Rittel and Weber, an acknowledgement of both the difficulty of understanding the causal loops, and, as they put it, the different publics involved. It's when people ignore either side of it and the interactions between the two that problems arise. It's then that their responses to complexity are inadequate, because they're ignoring certain aspects of it, which the different systemic perspectives draw our attention to, and which the different systems approaches, methodologies give us ways of addressing. So I tried to put us in a position to understand that, and what again is original, I think, is my attempt to pin down these 5 systemic perspectives as not just opportunistic ways of looking at the world, but actually well-grounded systemic perspectives that can take us somewhere. They're not just metaphors for immediate use and gratification. They're well proven to be useful for analyzing and improving our understanding of the world, and for giving us ways of acting in the world which have enabled success, some success for the human species over time.
Okay, thank you. I got another question, but I'll come later if.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time is over. But Guilherme, it's okay to open for one more question.
Yes, of course, with me. Yes.
Okay, one more question. Flávio Orita.
Hello, Professor Michael. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very lightful. I'm actually not from this field, so I'm getting in touch with the topics. So it was very good to know your work. And
thank you, Flavio.
Yeah, so I'm from the computer science community, more on the soft engineering part. So one of the things that I was wondering is if do you have any thoughts on the role of artificial intelligence on the, in all of the system thinking, or in all this system complexity and etc. So maybe I'm not sure if the AI is actually. I'm actually sure that AI is playing a lot on this complexity. So, do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Flavio, in terms of long-term ways of making making systems or making organizations or societies more resilient, adaptable, capable of learning and changing in response to crises, then yes, I think approaches such as artificial intelligence do have a major role to play. So I'm thinking about how you might organize the health service to do things better in the future. And the problem at the moment is that the health service is organized in terms of specialisms and in terms of what it's capable of delivering, rather than in terms of individuals and their history as they engage with the health service. So I certainly think that you can use artificial intelligence to better monitor people's health, to keep track of their health, to alert practitioners to the health of individuals. So the health service is much more responsive to the people that it's seeking to serve than it is currently. The problem with crises, with black swan events, is of course you're having to tackle them with the things that you have at your disposal at this moment. But going forward and thinking of the future, then I'm sure that artificial intelligence can contribute to the redesign of our systems, so they are indeed much more flexible and adaptive and responsive to the increasing turbulence and complexity of the world that we face. So keep working at what you're working at, but make sure that you're integrating it into some of these wider concerns, and then your work, I'm sure, will help a great deal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Professor Jackson, I have no words to thank you. And in this virtual world, we have some difficulty to express. Okay?
One question.
Como?
Só mais uma pergunta. Eu queria uma pergunta rápida para ele.
Okay. One more question, Professor Jackson.
Yes. Yes.
Leomar has one more.
Leomar.
Okay.
Professor,
yes, I'm happy.
Professor, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. I really enjoy your presentation. In particular, I imagine a world where the sustainable governance model is based on a series of principles, among which I highlight the multidimensional view of complexity and shared view of reality. In that sense, what do you think of the principles of the governance of common pool resource model by Elinor Autumn? How closely does this model match your proposal for managing complexity?
Thank you, Eliomar. I'm afraid because of the transmission, not because of your English, I didn't quite get that question. You're asking me how some kind of model corresponds to the way I've explained, which I think is a better way of dealing with complexity. But I don't know what model it is you're asking me about. Can you hear me? Leonardo, I'm sorry, I really did not get the question clearly enough.
Eliomar, ele não entendeu muito bem a sua pergunta. Você está ouvindo?
O sinal não estava bom, Eliomar. Talvez você pudesse repetir a sua questão.
Acho que ele caiu.
Caiu.
Você
conseguiu entender a questão, Léo? Você consegue retransmitir para o professor Jackson?
Não, porque picou aqui para mim também, eu não consegui entender.
Eu também não consegui pegar, não.
Well.
But my problem was I did not understand the question clearly enough. Hello?
Hello. I'm trying to contact Eliomar, just a little. Well,
Professor Jackson, the sound from Eliomar was not really good. We are trying to contact him again.
Okay. So you didn't understand the question either, Dante?
I didn't.
No.
It was not good. The sound was not good. I also didn't understand.
Sandro, você conseguiu pegar a questão dele e retransmitir?
I think so.
Okay.
Are you listening? Are you hearing me?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Professor Jackson, I think I will try to let's say reframe, not to reframe, but to reformulate what Iliomar already asked to you. He was asking how your model or how your approach could be related to the approach of Eleonore Ostrom to manage common pool resources.
Okay. Yes. An aspect of it very much so. I think a lot of people recognize there are similarities between what Ostrom says about the commons and Stafford Beer's viable system model. I don't know whether Raoul is still present. I don't know whether he's done any work upon that, the relationship between Ostrom's model and the viable system model. But there are definitely key linkages there. And if let's say a society is, and I'm involved in a project with some Australians in creating a national resilience framework, and for that to work properly, it has to be coordinated at all levels, which is at the community level, the level of civil society, the level of the state, and the level of the federal government. And of course, Ostrom is talking about how you gain, how the commons at the more local level can operate in a way which is beneficial to the whole of that level. And the viable system model is talking about how certain initiatives of that kind can be coordinated. So I'm not an expert on Ostrom, but I've certainly seen a comparison in a book by Angelo Espinosa and John Walker, a comparison between the work of Eleanor Ostrom and Stafford Beer's viable system model, which shows that I think Ostrom has 8 principles for the commons, and they can be related to the principles which the viable system model expresses. So the answer to the question is that I think that that is an area which is certainly worth exploration. I think there's a lot in that to try and make us more resilient in the future, because it has to be local levels responding as well as government responding. Thank you, Sandra.
Ok. Anyone else? Mais alguém? Eu acabei de receber notícias aqui do Leomar e ele está tentando retornar, tá? Bom, o Dante está online também? Professor Dante? Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal? A gente ainda está aberto para perguntas. O Alfredo. Alfredo, pode fazer pergunta.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Professor Michael. I enjoyed very much your talk. I was wondering, as far as I understood, there is a kind of improvement from the restricted complexity approach to the general one. I was thinking whether it should be necessary to make an advantage of adopting a general complexity approach in solving problematic situations. I was wondering whether there is the need of awareness of the practitioners who are trying to apply those theoretical frameworks. What kind of awareness they need, if there is this necessity?
Thank you, Alfredo. You have a very good grasp of what I've said. Thank you, because it allows me to. It's horses for courses, really, in the sense that many problems can be dealt with using the approach that stems from restricted complexity, as we saw with the Segura River case. There, it was appropriate to address it as a case of restricted complexity. And because the main form of complexity in Rescher's terms was ontological rather than cognitive, it worked. But my argument would be for cases such as COVID-19, it's a mistake to seek to address them as cases of restricted complexity. You're driven to perceive them as cases of general complexity. And as you say, if you do that from the beginning, then you're going to be in a better position to understand what you're confronting and to react to that. Now, how do we get decision makers to think in those terms? I think they are already starting to do so, and that COVID-19 is having some impact here. For example, I alluded to the work in Australia, which I think the Australians have done very well with COVID-19, but they're now already planning for a resilient future. So they're asking questions like, from the machine perspective, where do our inputs come to protect our health service? And they're finding that, they know that 90% of the drugs that they need actually are imported from China, so that their supply chains are not resilient. So how much of that needs to be manufactured in Australia, some of these drugs, or what about local partners like New Zealand and the South Sea Islands? And can they do it there? On the other hand, how can trust and social cohesion be built up so that society is more resilient in the future? Because once you destroy trust and social cohesion, and there's an argument that our societies are going that way because of an increasing inequality among many things, but that's a very, very important one. And because of increasing inequality, parts of society being left behind, and you get Donald Trump and you get Brexit and so on. You can argue that people are starting to address, in Australia, I'm saying people are starting to address those issues. And similarly, I would think that finally in the UK, people are saying, well, we can't just think in silos. We've got to be more multidisciplinary. We've got to be more multi-perspectival. We've got to start taking a systems approach rather than a reductionist approach to these complex problems, multidimensional problems that we're facing. So I think your question is absolutely opposite, absolutely right. And all I can say is that I think progress is being made as decision makers are having to confront the situation that they are in, and the failure that traditional science and traditional ways of addressing these complex situations become more and more apparent to them. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Professor Leomar is unable to reconnect. I will have to continue without him. Professor Jackson, like I said, I have no words to thank you. This virtual world have some difficulties to express certain emotions. And I'm sure that everyone here agrees that your lecture brought both brightness to this conference. I would like to thank you on behalf of the organization of 15th CBS. I ask you to join us. You can follow the conference with the same access credential, just to use the link you received to enter this room. In the sequence, we will have a section of presentation of papers, and at 2 p.m., the lecture of the Professor Christian Prispino with the title System Medicine and the Future of the Public Health Systems. I just want to thank you, Professor.
Leonardo, thank you. Well, thank you first of all to Donald Durat and Dante for inviting me. It was a great pleasure and privilege to be able to address you. Thank you, Leonardo, for dealing with the technical issues. I think that worked okay in the end. It was very nice seeing you all, seeing your faces at various times during this presentation, and I enjoyed it very much. So thank you for having me and listening to me in Brazil. I'm going off for a coffee now, but I have enjoyed it. Thank you.